Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. Actually, this is video 1 of 3. This series will be about Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi no Jutsu, or Kusunoki Ryu Ninjutsu. And rather than simply read some document with little or no context, or simply list a series of out-of-context techniques, we're going to instead focus on the history leading up to Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi, the basic layout of Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi arts, a look at the overall intention and purpose of the Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi arts, the difference between Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi and other shinobi, and the role of shinobi in Kusunoki Ryu versus other systems or time period realities. So this is actually going to be 3 videos, and it's basically, this first video is going to be the number 1, number 2 and 3 will be video 2, and 4 and 5 will be video 3. So again, rather than issue a single 30-minute or 60-minute video, these 5 topics will be broken into these smaller videos to try to manage the complexity of the topic and the time investment of you, the viewer. So let's look at the how and the why of Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi arts. And to understand the how and the why of the Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi arts, and the samurai who utilized these arts, we must first recap the history of the system. So we're going to start, first step is the Jingunden traditions, starting with the Jimu no Maki, or traditions from early Japanese time period. And then we also have the Shotoku Jingunden, for example. Now this can be conceptualized as either the ancient tradition which is related to Mononobe Shinto, or we can even just start with the tradition that we know began in 1570s. That was in a previous video, we won't recap that here. But basically we're starting with Jingunden traditions, which are the sort of original imperial military traditions. That puts us into step 2, which is the Genji traditions, which is like Genji Jingunden as well. Here we have the Oe Genji with their documents such as the Hijitsu Ikansho, the Kinitsushu, Art of War commentaries, etc., etc. Then we have the Tada Genji, which is basically all the material from Genji Mitsunaka and Genji Reimitsu, etc., etc. And this even contains material surrounding figures such as Genji Yoshitsune. Then, third step, Chinese warfare manuals, primarily the 6 secret teachings, Sun Tzu, aka the Art of War, and then the teaching called the 3 strategies. Now you'll see in the right corner, I have it circled, all of these three, all of this overlaps. So all of this has been discussed in detail in previous videos, but here it is a reminder. All of this comes into play when you're talking about Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi history. And of course you have to take into account the Kenmu Restoration, the Southern Court, and the Second Southern Court. After Kusunoki Masashige and his relatives are living and utilizing these teachings, so they have the traditions that basically Kusunoki Masashige and his brothers and cousins, etc., uncles, etc., they have the traditions, the Genji traditions, the Jingunden traditions, they have those. Then they engage in the Kenmu Restoration. And this causes Masashige and his chief retainers such as Onchi Sagan to experience and to learn more deeply and differently these teachings. In other words, experience brings about new insights. And because of the guerrilla nature of Kusunoki's forces, he begins to take the teachings he received and develops them deeper and more specifically for his needs, for small guerrilla tactics as opposed to larger tactics, larger force tactics, so smaller tactics. He initially creates a system called the 7-part conspiracy, and we covered that in a previous video. The 7-part conspiracy is based on the 6 secret teachings, and this is, even though the word shinobi doesn't appear yet, this is where the root of Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi comes from, is this 7-part conspiracy. However, during the 1400s, so now we're past Masashige's life and we're in the 1400s. So Masashige's descendants, who are now fighting for the Second Southern Court, reorganize the teachings in a way that is more in alignment with what they're thinking at the time, which is more utilizing of Sun Tzu's Art of War. And this gives rise to the quote-unquote 5 shinobi. And in this case, the shinobi is a spy. So the previous teaching of the 7-part conspiracy is retained, but this 5 shinobi or the 5 spy model is added to the method. Now let's take a moment to look at this because it's important to understand these points. Originally, the Genji traditions favored the 6 secret teachings over the Sun Tzu. The Oe Genji actually wrote commentaries that essentially say that the Sun Tzu can only be useful to a samurai if it's edited to meet the culture of a samurai. The Genji, however, viewed the 6 secret teachings as something more user-friendly to the samurai. So this is why the 6 secret teachings initially are the go-to manual. It was around this same time, which is, we were looking at that time period from the 900s to the 1100s, that documents such as the Kinetsushu began to utilize some of the Sun Tzu Art of War, but it also rejects or heavily edits these parts as well. There's also a document written by the Oe Genji called The Classic of Fighting Wars, and it also shows a heavily edited aspect of the Sun Tzu Art of War. Again, the Art of War is obviously not rejected, but it seems like the samurai at this early stage, the Genji clan, they like the 6 secret teachings pretty much as it is. They only like the Art of War when it's been very changed and edited to sort of match the ideology of the time. Anyway, for more information on this, one has to research early Oe Genji war manuals. We do not have the time to dive into this at present. This is like a 3-hour talk, and we're not going there. Anyway, but again, like I said, this is why originally the 6 secret teachings model of espionage was favored by the Genji and why the Sun Tzu was not. However, by the mid to late 1400s, during the period of the Second Southern Court and the Onin War, the Sun Tzu methods they gained popularity. And while the original teachings based on the 6 secret teachings are, as I said, they're maintained and retained, new innovations caused members of the Kusunoki band of Southern Court samurai to imagine and utilize the Sun Tzu model. And this gives rise to the 5 shinobi. Now actually, it's the 6 shinobi, but we'll get to that later on, after we clarify some of these other points. So, originally, Masashige conceived of a shinobi simply as the act of sneaking in or out of a location. And while this was an important task, and early Kusunoki Ryu does have teachings such as the Hinso no Ho or the disguise method using the makeup, etc., etc. There's a video on that. And spells related to sneaking in and out. Again, with a huge emphasis on sneaking out. So Kusunoki Ryu has teachings specifically for sneaking in and sneaking out. A huge emphasis on sneaking out. And these teachings come during the time of the 6 secret teachings, before the 6 shinobi appear. But anyway, this is conceived of as a different thing. So there's the espionage, and then there's the techniques of sneaking in and out. But due to the nature of small group guerrilla warfare in the 1400s, even smaller than in Masashige's life, it seems that the spies also had to be specialists in sneaking in and out. And this is where spies become shinobi. So to arrive at the first true Kusunoki Ryu shinobi, we have 7 steps. So step 1, take the Genji traditions based on the 6 secret teachings to form a foundation of espionage. Next, understand that espionage has 7 key parts and arrange your agents into these 7 key roles and positions. Step 3, add the lessons and insights learned by Masashige during the Kemu restoration. 4 is to add the lessons and insights learned by the Kusunoki family, that is Masashige's direct line and relative families, such as branches of Kusunoki or the Wada or the Onchi family. So take all of the lessons learned by them during the Nambokucho Jidai. 5, add lessons and insights learned by the second Southern Court guerrillas in the 1400s. 6, add the innovations to espionage in which Sun Tzu's model is used and how spies now must also be masters of sneaking in and out of locations of infiltration and exfiltration. And that puts us to 7, arrive at the Kusunoki Ryu shinobi. So now that we have an idea of how and why the Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi comes about, now again that's a very brief overview, but it's a decent overview. It gives you a basic structure. Let's look at the question of where do we find Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi in terms of records and documents. So the main Kusunoki schools of the late 1500s and early 1600s have interlocking and intermixed traditions. That's teachings that they share, students they share, documents that they share, etc., etc. Now these teachings that are shared among the main lines record these Shinobi teachings. So for example, the main Kusunoki line, of course, has the Kaden, of course, has the original Six Secret Teachings version of espionage from Masashige's time, which is the 7-part conspiracy. And then other parts of the Kaden, which are added in the 1400s and 1500s, contain some of the Shinobi parts. You also have the Nanki Ryu, which is Kusunoki Fuden and Yui Shosetsu schools. So when you usually hear about Kusunoki Ryu Gungaku, that's Nanki Ryu. Right? If it's Kusunoki Fuden and Yui Shosetsu, that's Nanki Ryu. And then you have Taiheki Ryu, which is the Kusunoki Ryu school, which is based around the Taiheki commentaries. Which again, when I say commentary, there's a lot of spiritual, military, espionage, politics, all kinds of teachings are in the commentary. So that's Taiheki Ryu. And then you have the Izu Domain Kusunoki Ryu, and they all seem to share the Kaden, right? So you have the individual schools have their own teachings, they all share the Kaden, and then they all have these, their own teachings are also shared among each other. So anyway, basically, these main Kusunoki schools are where you find the Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi teachings. Again, it's very extensive. Will take way too long to go in this topic in depth, but for the sake of these videos, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on one document from 1594 that all the main Kusunoki schools utilize and share this one document. Now let's take a moment to specifically talk about the Izu Domain Kusunoki Ryu. It's of particular importance in this particular case because they essentially become the reservoir of almost all the mainline documents. So they have access to the Kaden, and when Nanki Ryu is terminated in 1651, they maintain a lot of Nanki Ryu's documents. Izu Domain Kusunoki Ryu also has a deep working relationship with the Shotoku Jingunden in Izu Domain. Izu Domain Kusunoki Ryu also seems to obtain a lot receive a lot of the Taiheki Ryu teachings and documents when that tradition also begins to disappear in the 1600s as well. So the Izu Domain Kusunoki has their own teachings, but they're also a reservoir, a collector of the other mainline documents in the later 1600s. Now, I have to be very specific on this and very clear. I am not including schools such as Hojo Ryu, Shin Kusunoki Ryu, aka Natori Ryu, and in all the other schools that use some Kusunoki Ryu in their teachings, but that are not part of the mainline progression. This is because those schools are usually mixtures of some Kusunoki Ryu with other non-Kusunoki Ryu traditions, and the final product is oftentimes very different from the original Kusunoki Ryu. Thus, we're only sticking to the mainline schools when we're talking about Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi. We will, in video 3, look at some compare and contrast, but when we're talking about Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi, we're sticking to the mainline schools. Now, if you look at your screen, you're going to see a very basic map of Japan, pulled it from Wikipedia. You'll see there's a green area and then a red area. So that green area, that's the Izu domain in the 1600s. Right? And this is important because there's a lot of stuff that takes place with the Izu domain Kusunoki Ryu in this area. This is also where some documents record that Kusunoki Fuden, the founder of the Kusunoki Ryu Gungaku, aka the Nanki Ryu, there's documents that say the Kusunoki Fuden actually came from the Izu domain. Now this also interlocks with the Kusunoki main line because you see in the red, the area that's highlighted red with the red arrow, that is where the main branch of the Kusunoki moved to in the early part of the 1600s. The main branch of Kusunoki moved to the Mito domain, aka Hitachi province, in the early 1600s. So you can see where the main line family is very geographically close to the Izu Domain Kusunoki Ryu tradition. So, and again, the Izu Domain Kusunoki Ryu is, again, it's very important because it's the reservoir of the main schools. The main line, the Nankiryu, the Taikiryu, and itself. It becomes a reservoir of these four traditions. So now that we've gone over this basic overview of how the Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi comes to be and where we can find the teachings and records and why we can find them in those places, we're going to bring this video to an end. Now the next video will discuss the types of Shinobi in Kusunoki Ryu and the basic overview of Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi ideology and methodology. Again, this only counts for Kusunoki Ryu Shinobi of the actual mainline Kusunoki Ryu schools. This does not count for non-Kusunoki Ryu mainline traditions. Then video 3 will look at how it compares and contrasts to some other ninja traditions and politics of the 1600s.